He put my name on a loan I never agreed to, then called me naive for worrying about it. I say it flat because the shock was gone long before I learned how to count the zeros. He, Michael, signed documents in my handwriting, opened accounts under my maiden name, moved deposits into companies I had never heard of, and told me he was doing what a husband should, protecting his family. That was the first lie. The second was that he thought I wouldn't notice. It hurt because I had given up things for that family he claimed to protect. I had given up my salary, the friends I worked with, the small cabinet of independence that still belonged to me. I had believed in the slow way you believe a drip will eventually stop, that our household relied on him for finances and me for the rest. He used that belief like a key. We married in June of 2013. The wedding was small. My mother wore pearls she'd been saving for a decade. We rented a 2-bedroom in a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburbs north of the city, bought a bigger house in 2016, and 3 years after that, we had Claire, then Ben. Michael had always been in business. He worked long hours. He smiled politely at PTA meetings. He told stories about closing deals and flying to clients. I managed the home, the bills, the pediatrician appointments, the school fundraisers. My work was visible in different ways: dinners, doctor's visits, play dates, and I thought that gave me bargaining power of a kind, knowledge of routines, leverage with the kids, an unspoken claim on our life. What I didn't have was access. He insisted on being in charge of money. He said it was easier that way. It sounded practical. He said I should focus on the kids, not bookkeeping. He kept the passwords, the credit cards, the login for the mortgage portal. He told me the accounts were joint and then showed me statements only when he needed silence more than honesty. When I asked how much we had saved for college, he'd say, "It's fine. Don't worry about numbers." When I asked for a second credit card, he made a face and said we didn't need it. The phrase, "you'll complicate things," became a way to shut me out. There was a dependence built into our life that I agreed to, partly out of love, partly because it was what felt manageable. For the first 5 years, it felt manageable. I expected him to handle taxes and contracts. I expected, stupidly, that marriage meant transparency. I expected the worst to announce itself quickly. Instead, the erosion took the long, neat path of a man who knew the rules and knew how to stretch them. My first real suspicion came in late 2018 when I found a receipt tucked inside the cookbook I used to teach Claire how to make pancakes. It was a wire transfer confirmation, 5 figures, paid to a company called Holloway Holdings. I asked him about it at dinner. He smiled and said it was for a vendor at work. I believed him because it was the sort of payment a company might make. I accepted the explanation and then started watching. Watching became a quiet occupation. I checked our credit reports in the middle of the night using a friend's account I still had, the one she had given me after her own identity theft. I learned how to read financial statements the way some people learn new languages, slowly, then obsessively. I made my own spreadsheets, dates, payees, odd memos, and I kept them in a folder at the bottom of my sock drawer. It felt ridiculous and necessary at once. I wasn't trying to catch him for petty reasons. I was trying to understand whether our life, the mortgage, the kids' future, the retirement fund he mentioned like a myth, was real or an illusion he was subsidizing with paper lies. The escalations began small and then snapped. The first loop, money moved and so did his excuses. In January 2019, he told me the company needed cash flow for a strategic acquisition. The words sounded heavy and important on his lips. A transfer was made from a joint account into a business account he said he controlled. I asked for the paperwork. He promised it the next day and then said he had left it at the office. The next week he started flying more, the next month, and the joint account showed an overdraft fee. He paid it off quickly with a look that suggested mistakes were my fault because I panicked. My reaction was not dramatic. I made copies, I filed them, I watched. The consequence was quiet. Our cushion shrank. The situation worsened because I started making decisions based on incomplete information. I cancelled a small renovation plan we had discussed for the kitchen because the math didn't add up. He called me cautious and then indulgent. He said I made a small. He said it in a tone that made me feel mean for wanting new cabinet doors. By mid-2019, the lies had a pattern. He would create a need, present a solution that centralized power with him, then tighten access under the guise of keeping us safe. He told me we should simplify finances, and he closed accounts in my name or transferred them under shell company names. He set up companies that sounded professional, names like Northbridge Services or Elm Court Management, and he signed them with his name. I didn't see the paperwork. He told me they were tax shields and strategic planning. He told me I was too anxious about paperwork. When I tried to involve other people, my sister, my mother, he was charming and composed. He made me look like a worrywart. At family dinners, he told small jokes about my clipboards. People laughed. I learned to laugh too until it got harder. The humiliation was slow. It wasn't overt, it was gestures. Him taking over conversations about money, him correcting me in front of relatives about how finances work, his subtle patronizing. People started directing questions to him because he was the one who always had the answer. He used that. The second escalation loop introduced a third party, a man named Aaron, who ran a boutique investment advisory they hired in 2020. Aaron was soft-spoken, precise, and good at making promises sound inevitable. Michael said Aaron could grow our small retirement account into something that matched his aspirations. Aaron brought glossy charts and projections. He also brought legal language that put Michael in charge of many decisions. I asked for meetings. I was told they were unnecessary because you don't know these instruments. I asked for copies of contracts. I received summaries. The consequence was the same. Control became centralized and my complaints were framed as sentimental impediments to professional growth. I started sleeping badly. I would wake at 3 a.m., sit at the kitchen table with a lamp on, and look at numbers like constellations. I found a pattern in the memos attached to company payments. Consultant fee, vendor payout, affiliate settlement. Those descriptors were vague, the kind of language that could mean anything. When I matched them against state business filings, some of the companies didn't exist. Others existed briefly, then vanished. I printed everything, even the tiny attachments from emails I wasn't supposed to see, and slipped them under the mattress. It was small and irrational, like keeping a cache of foreign coins you can't explain but cannot give up. The third loop was when pressure turned its face toward me. So in late 2020, Michael started insisting I refinance the mortgage to take advantage of market opportunities. He said rates were low. He said he could get a better repayment plan if my name appeared as co-borrower in a particular way. He showed me papers and asked me to sign. One signature, he said. It was for convenience. He said it in a voice that suggested we were smart for doing it. I signed without reading the fine print, the way you sometimes sign permission slips for field trips because the alternative is to stand out. It turned out that signature allowed him to present the mortgage as collateral for a line of credit for one of his companies. In March 2021, a notice from the bank arrived, an increase in the line, approval of a commercial loan, an attachment I hadn't recognized. When I asked what it was for, and he said our home was now an asset being leveraged for long-term growth, he said it confidently. The consequence was immediate but not public. One more layer of vulnerability. The situation worsened because I could not easily disentangle the house from his business obligations without a messy legal fight neither of us could afford. Around the same time, our pediatrician appointment produced an incident that still feels small and huge at once. Claire asked why we were whispering about money in the grocery aisle. She was 6. I wanted to tell her that sometimes adults make complicated mistakes. But Michael, tighter-lipped than usual, said we were planning a surprise. He smiled and offered to buy ice cream for both kids. I felt ashamed because my mind was busy with spreadsheets and receipts, as if those were the freight the family sat on. I stayed awake thinking about what it means to let a child feel the shift in weather before the clouds. I did something then that I had never done before. I opened an account in my name alone. I had enough savings from the rare freelance work I took in secret, and I put it somewhere he did not know. It was petty, perhaps practical, and I kept it hidden like a tiny emergency. I started using disposable email addresses to query public filings. I found a DBA registration tied to his company, with my maiden name listed as an emergency contact. I had never given permission. Someone on a form had written my contact. The fourth escalation loop involved direct intimidation. In 2022, Michael found the account I had opened. He called me in the middle of the night, his voice low and fast, and asked if I had been running accounts behind his back. He accused me of pretending to be naive so I could hide things from him. I said nothing, which may have been the only kind thing I could have done. The consequence was that he started monitoring me more closely. He checked our phones, he demanded passwords, he questioned who I had spoken to that week. He said that if I was going to be secretive, then perhaps the house needed a more public solution. Then came the humiliation directed at others. At a holiday party, he corrected me about the address of the college fund like it was a trivia question. He told one of my friends that I was not involved in the finances, so she should speak to him about contributions. He made me the joke. The consequence was that I felt smaller in rooms I had inhabited comfortably for years. Financial pressure ramped. He began to delay payments to contractors for our yard and the man who cleaned out the gutters. He started returning checks late to the community theatre where Claire took classes. People began asking me whether we were okay. I lied and said we were. The consequence was a tightening circle of creditors who were patient at first and then less so. The situation worsened when a mechanic called to say the car note was late. By the end of 2022, I had a drawer full of printed invoices, copies of emails, and bank statements. I had a notebook in which I tracked dates, bank account numbers, and the names of shell companies. I had a small, obstinate belief that the truth, if assembled, could become leverage. But I had to be careful. I had to balance motherhood, appearances, and the slow work of assembly. My leverage was not legal training or money. It was information and timing. The low point came when he discovered my spreadsheet and burned it. He found the folder in the sock drawer during an argument, and with a look I remember like cold glass, he took it and threw the pages into the kitchen trash. He mocked me for thinking paper mattered. Then he left. He said he was staying with a colleague. He stopped answering my messages for days. He filed for separation the next week, as if leaving were an announcement rather than the final act of a long drift. I felt hollowed. The house that had been a sanctuary became a courtroom. He said I was paranoid. He told the children to pack favorite toys for the weekend with his parents. He called our neighbors and said we needed space. People took small steps away. The quiet in the house multiplied. Being left with the kids and no access to the accounts I had once managed felt worse than the loss of money. It was as if the entire grammar of my life had been edited without my consent. I lost leverage when he took the car. He took his name off utilities and moved many accounts out of joint status. He put me on an island. He began to threaten me legally. He said he would claim in court that I had been an impediment to his business and that our separation was inevitable because of my instability. He used a phrase like that with a lawyer's care. He had the advantage of mobility, of networks, of a gloss that convinced many people he was the reasonable one. The low point was a quiet day in April 2023 when a process server came to my door with papers that looked official and felt like a verdict. I remember sitting on the couch with Ben watching cartoons and feeling like a spectator at the strangest, most private trial. My daughter asked why I looked tired, and I told her I had stayed up late. That was true in one way. I had stayed up late, making notes and planning in ways that didn't feel brave. I had thought of leaving, but leaving costs money and sometimes safety. I had no clear place to go that didn't require a deposit he could seize through legal motion. I was, in those months, financially and emotionally trapped in a house whose title he had cleverly made useful to others. Then something small and stupid became the hinge. Aaron, the investment advisor, had an assistant named Priya, who was careless in the way exhausted people are careless. Priya sent an internal ledger to Aaron with a note asking for clarification on a payment labelled Reimbursement Holloway. She had meant to send it to Michael, but the autocomplete filled in my email address. I had used it once to contact a vendor. The email arrived at 2:13 a.m. while I was up charting expenses. The subject line was bland. I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a file, an export of accounts payable from Michael's company spanning 3 years. The spreadsheet had vendor names, amounts, dates, and crucially, memo fields that read like confessions. Loan repayment to MW Personal, consulting fee, repay to family account, vendor refund to Holloway, transfer to mortgage line. The names of shell companies matched the DBAs I had found. There were routing numbers, tiny recurring transfers on the 28th of each month, and records of payments into an account that, when I traced it, belonged to a trust in another state. I sat very still and did something I had been building toward for years. I copied everything into a new file and printed it. I made a paper trail that matched the one he had tried to erase. When I confronted him with the ledger the next day, he laughed at first, a short, incredulous sound. Then he went very white. He said, "Where did you get that?" I said I didn't want to tell him everything. I needed a lawyer. I needed a plan. We met with a lawyer named Rachel, whose office smelled like coffee and law books. She was precise and not given to melodrama. She looked at the ledger and said the pattern suggested misappropriation. She warned that civil cases are slow and expensive and that criminal referral depended on the prosecutor. She also said, without softness, that my decision to keep copies and to not confront him publicly so far had given us a tactical advantage. The ledger was a mistake on their side. Priya, in her exhaustion, had handed us a map. The turning point then was not dramatic in the sense of a confession or a courtroom scene. It was an accidental email and a person's fatigue. It was also a choice. With the ledger, we had proof of transfers and an explanation for the mortgages shifted as collateral. It allowed us to petition the bank to freeze certain accounts and to put a hold on the line tied to the mortgage. It also allowed Rachel to draft subpoenas. The first consequence was not fireworks. It was paperwork served at his office and a polite, stunned phone call in which Aaron insisted there had been a mistake. He tried to negotiate quietly. He offered to sign documents that would transfer certain assets and to resign from boards. He offered me one of the shell company's stock. I listened and I thought about Claire and Ben and their futures. I remembered how the mechanic had called last year and how I had lied to neighbours. I remembered the cookbook receipt and the nights at the table, and I understood that his quiet offers were attempts to clean the visible mess without addressing the structure that allowed him to move money in the first place. We pursued both civil and criminal channels. The prosecutor's office opened an inquiry in late summer. The bank undertook an internal audit. Subpoenas returned documents that matched the ledger, invoices that were fabricated, checks that were endorsed by people who did not exist, and wire transfers that moved through jurisdictions designed to be opaque. For the first time in years, the word fraud appeared in official correspondence. The consequences were not instantaneous redemption. They were legal hearings, bank holds, and the slow task of untangling what belonged to whom. Michael hired attorneys who used the same tricks he had used on me. Paperwork that implied sensible business judgment, witnesses who testified to his character, and a calm voice that tried to separate intention from action. He pled no contest to certain civil counts and eventually accepted mediation for restitution. Criminally, he was indicted on counts that would play out differently depending on plea bargains and the appetite of prosecutors for trial. What he could not erase was the ledger that matched the bank records and the shell companies. Some assets were frozen, some were reassigned. The mortgage arrangement was restructured so that the house could remain ours but under court oversight. It felt like a partial victory. It felt like a rebalancing rather than a triumph. He was not magically punished in the way revenge fantasies imagine. He paid fines. He accepted supervised probation. He made restitution in increments. I accepted that the children would not get a perfect closure. They got hearings, quiet explanations, and the knowledge that grown people sometimes do unwise things. The social consequences were sharp. Friends split in odd ways. Some assumed I had known more. Some assumed I had known less. People I once greeted in the cul-de-sac stopped by less often. Claire's teacher asked gently whether schools should be aware of something. Ben picked up on the tension and developed a new habit of hugging me in parking lots. The community felt rearranged. I learned quickly that people prefer simple stories, and ours had no simple arc. Emotionally, the long aftermath was a sequence of small reckonings. I had to learn to read bank statements again, to be assertive and specific, to attend mediation without flinching. I learned to tell our story with care because I did not want my children to feel like actors in a cautionary tale. There were nights I still woke up and replayed the humiliation, but there were also mornings when I could breathe without the dry panic that had lived in my throat. A slow, practical rebuilding began. I went back to work part-time, first taking on freelance writing, and then a steady job at a non-profit that paid enough for a practical life. I made a budget with the kids, involving them in decisions about small luxuries and lines for saving. The most realistic consequence was that not everything returned. Our finances were smaller. The trust he had built with community partners was irreparably damaged. He lost business relationships. He lost social capital. I lost illusions about marriage as a mutual ledger. But I gained something I had not expected, a clearer sense of my own boundaries. It was not an uplifting moral, it was a fact. When money gets weaponized inside a home, the weapon is also the language that justifies it. Taking it apart required patience, paperwork, and allies. Michael's life did not implode theatrically. He did not end up a caricature. He made restitution, kept a reduced professional role, and, in time, moved out of the house. We kept custody arrangements. The children saw him at weekends and sometimes longer in school holidays. He was occasionally present at school events in a way that felt like a different man, measured, apologetic, sometimes genuine. That did not erase the past. It simply became part of the history we navigated. There was one quiet consequence that mattered to me more than any legal or financial settlement. My mother stopped calling me naive in that soft, teasing way she once did. She visited more often. She brought casseroles and long, quiet afternoons. She did not lecture. My sister, who had once rolled her eyes at my spreadsheets, became a partner in small household affairs. The neighbour who once asked only about our garden now asked whether I needed childcare occasionally. These were small repairs, not dramatic reconciliations, but necessary ones. When the legal dust settled, I met Michael once more in a mediation room that smelled too much like institutional coffee. He did not beg. He did not try to persuade me with grand explanations. He kept his explanations short and factual, and then he left. The children were at school that day. I walked out of the building and drove home along a stretch of road that was suddenly ordinary. I had been living under a narrative of betrayal for years. Stepping out of it did not feel freeing in a cinematic way. It felt like the air after a storm, wet, sharp, and clear. In the aftermath, I did things I had not allowed myself to do before. I opened my own account with the bank rather than in secret. I set up an estate plan that named guardians and trustees I trusted. I told Claire the truth in a way that did not burden her. I said simply that some adults make choices that hurt others, but that we would be okay. She asked whether Daddy would go to jail. I said I did not know. And then we talked about how to be kind to ourselves. People ask whether I regret the years I spent feeling like an accomplice. The answer is complicated in the way most honest answers are. I regret small things. Not having copies earlier, letting him keep keys, not involving a third party sooner. But I do not regret the decision to protect the kids by staying until I could leave responsibly. That's not a moral lecture, it's a practical account. Leaving would have been easier in the short term and perhaps ruinous in the long one. I made a choice with imperfect information. I also do not romanticize the aftermath. Repair took longer than I imagined. There were months when we ate cheaper groceries and doubled up on activities at the library. There were nights when I worried about whether what we had left would be enough for college. But there were also mornings when I sat at the kitchen table with Claire doing fractions and realized I had regained the space to teach her the kind of prudence that does not mean suspicion, but means attention. If you are listening because something in this resonates, I will not give you a checklist. I will only say, watch the memos and keep copies. When documents land in your email, read them. When someone insists you are naive, ask why they think that and what power they are hiding behind that word. And if you can, build a small reserve that is yours alone. Those are not lessons. They are small practical measures. I am not proud of the years I spent feeling like a gullible woman. I am relieved to have been persistent enough to find the ledger that came by accident and determined enough to keep going when it all felt like it might collapse. The story does not end with one triumph. It ends with a slow reassembling of life. Not perfect, but ours. And for the first time in a long while, mostly honest. If anything in my story connected with you, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. And if you've ever had to untangle something complicated yourself, I'd like to hear about it. What did you learn?